This is day 3 of the 2026 Idyllwild Bible School. Our third period teacher is Brother Martyn Lawrence. His general subject is the way of the sea. Today's topic is the Exodus of Kings. Brother Martyn.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. Morning, everybody. Not bad. Donuts are having an impact. I can see that. Well done. Good. So when we were getting ready to come out this week, we got the link, as you will have done, for the Idyllwild t-shirts. And we were quite excited about getting some Idyllwild branded gear. Unfortunately, the website only took an American credit card. So unfortunately, didn't get a chance to have one. But it got me thinking in this country of entrepreneurship that maybe I could come up with some ideas of my own. And so based on something that happened yesterday morning, I thought this might be a new sort of brand idea for you guys to pick up. And I quite like the back, actually. The back's perhaps the best part of all. So if you need me for any licensing deals, Chris, or some kind of sales distribution idea, we'll have a chat afterwards and we'll go from there. Anyway, right, enough of that rubbish. Let's move on. This is where we are. We're in number 3. We've done the Genesis, we've moved through Joshua, and we are in the Kings today. And you will remember that this is our Exodus pattern that we've been thinking about. We've seen Israel through the desert, we've seen them across the river, and we've seen them into the land. But the story, of course, is not going to finish there. Every time we get somewhere, it feels like the Exodus has finished, feels like the story is fulfilled, and then it is taken out of our grasp. When you think about it, Scripture actually works like that all over the place. That we think God has resolved the problem of human sinfulness once and for all, and then Noah gets drunk, or Abraham goes into Egypt, or David sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof, or Peter hears the cock crowing and goes out weeping. And we realize again there is something yet to come before the process is finally made complete. You know, we think the national exodus is finished, but then Israel get hungry, or they start complaining about water. So as we travel towards the Kings this morning, I just want to stop in on the book of Judges as we go there. Just have a quick look in Judges 19. Because the entire book of Judges is going to sit as a review of the process that we see coming out of Egypt. In fact, I should have shared this with you just a second ago, because this is really where we're going this morning. We'll see in the Judges there is a reversal of the Exodus and a little bit of a recovery in the book of Ruth. We'll see Samuel portrayed for us as a new Moses character who is going to look like the Moses who is the founding prophet of the nation. And then when Saul comes on the scene, we'll see him looking eerily like a new Pharaoh, because he'll look like the Laban character that oppressed Jacob back in the book of Genesis. David's going to come before us not only as a new David, but also as a new Joshua. And then when Absalom appears on the scene, it will be as if the conquest is again turned back on its head. And it's only when we reach the days of Solomon that it looks, at least on the surface, as if the Exodus has finally been completed and we can stop and we can finish. But if you came on to Judges, you'll just see right the way down in verse 30 of Judges 19, after this awful incident with the concubine, that it is referenced in a particularly important way. Such a thing has never happened, people said, or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it and take counsel and speak. The entire book of Judges is going to work as an upside-down Exodus. They're going to begin the book, as it were, in a time of freedom, and yet they will fall as a nation subject to slavery to the king of Eglon and the Midianites and the Ammonites and the Philistines. They're going to forget the God of the Exodus right the way through the book of Judges, and will specifically be told, not just that they forgot God, but that they forgot the God of the Exodus. They won't drive out the nations. In other words, the conquest from the days of Joshua is going to come to an abrupt stop. And perhaps most worrying of all, Israel will begin to look like Egypt. Is a pretty good example of that. We're going to see that the Exodus has been almost entirely of the book of Ruth, which of course is set in the days of the Judges. And it's almost as if when we read through the Judges and we put the book of Ruth alongside it, we realize that it's almost seen as a rescue story about telling us that everything that's happened in the days of the Judges is just going to be halted, at least there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem went out of the land because of the famine to live in the land of Moab. We should put our antenna up, because we should now start to recognize that when people leave the land because of a famine, we're getting callbacks to when Abraham went out of the land because of a famine, when Joseph went out of the land because of a famine, when Jacob and his children went out of the land because of a famine. And so they will go on this journey. There will be this suffering where the two husbands are killed, or they die, and they come back to the land. And Naomi specifically is described as coming back as bitter as the water that the Israelites found in the wilderness. So we're going out, and it's only when we meet Ruth, who in Ruth 2 and verse 11 is fascinatingly compared with Abram, the man who first began to journey westwards and come to the land that God had laid out for them. Ruth 2 verse 11, because Boaz tells her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." It's Genesis 12, isn't it? It's part of the promise, or part of the command that God makes to Abram, so that he might come back into the land, and coincidentally, but not coincidentally, they come back to Bethlehem, would you believe it, at Passover time, which again should make us realize that the entire story of Ruth is a picture of an Exodus which has been recovered in the days of the Judges, when to move forward. And you'll realize that we're talking about the entire scripture here from a bird's eye view. We're deliberately moving over quickly, not because the details aren't important, but because sometimes when we begin to see things from 64,000 feet, we begin to make sense of some of the shapes that we might not have seen before. So you come is going to be laid, or is going to be done through the groundwork that Samuel will lay. So Samuel will be this new Moses character. Now, we don't have Egyptians in the book of Samuel, but we do have Philistines who will work in exactly the same way. If you come to 1 Samuel chapter 4, where there is this battle at Ebenezer and the ark is taken, Philistines are almost going to have captured God himself, that the box that they see as nothing more than a box, which you and I would see as representing the presence of Almighty God, is taken by the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas are slain, you remember. And in chapter 5 of 1 Samuel, they bring the ark of God and they place it in the house of Dagon and set it up before their God. You remember when we talked about those different elements of the Exodus process, we said that fundamental to it was that there was a battle of the gods that took place. And in the time of Israel and Egypt, it was those 10 plagues that culminated in the death of the firstborn. When the Pharaoh, representative of the gods of the Egyptians, loses his firstborn son, And God's firstborn son is brought out of Egypt by his power and by his might. Well, here again, we're going to see a battle of the gods take place. And the gods of the Philistines are going to be utterly crushed underfoot. So chapter 5 and verse 3, when the people of Ashdod arose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the Lord. So they took him and they stuck him back in his place, and they rose early the next morning, and behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his hands had been cut off, were lying on the threshold, and only the trunk of his body was remaining to him. The Philistines are being treated, or the Philistine gods are being treated like the Egyptian gods had been treated. They are being utterly humiliated. It's not really a surprise that that's what happens to them, because Genesis 10 tells us that the Philistines are descended from the Egyptians. So we've got a direct scriptural link between these two nations, and by seeing the way that God is going to deal with them. But as we make our way through the Old Testament, we're going to see this increasing distance put between the gods of the world and Yahweh of all the earth. Back in the book of Genesis, you remember Rachel sits on the false gods. You know, could you humiliate a household idol more than by sitting on it? I don't think you could. And then Egypt is plundered, and Samson is going to bring down the temple in Gaza, and Dagon is going to fall flat on his face and have his hands and his head cut off. The Exodus is a battle between Pharaoh's firstborn and God's firstborn, and over again, God is going to treat the gods of the nations with utter and complete contempt, thus laying a challenge for you and I in our discipleship. Do you, my brothers and sisters, treat the gods of this world with the contempt that we see in 1 Samuel 5, where it falls down before the Ark of the Covenant and bows before it? Do you take your career ambitions and lay them before the Ark of the Covenant in that way? Do you take your health challenges, your marriage? Do you take your children? Do you take the issues that you might have with money? Do you take your priorities that compete for attention every day? Do you take all of the issues that come before us and make them bow down in the same way that God makes the God of Dagon bow down? Because if you don't, then you need to wonder whether you can. So the God falls down before him, and verse 6, the hand of the Lord is heavy against the people of Ashdod and afflicted them with plagues. Your translation might say tumors or some other word, but I think we can parallel that stuff up. They are being plagued, just like the Egyptians are being plagued. And the question goes up, what do we do with the ark of the God of Israel? We need to move it and take it somewhere else. And there is a great panic that breaks out because of these plagues. And the Lord afflicts the men of the city. And the plagues at the end of verse 9 break out before them as well. It's the Exodus at a different time, looking slightly different, but looking like the Exodus. And it's not as if every episode that you see in the book of Judges or in Ruth or in Kings maps onto the Exodus perfectly. I'm not suggesting that. But it's like you've heard a piece of music and you can just hear the chords and you go, I've heard that before. That was in the earlier piece. That was in verse 1. And I'm hearing it again and it's making me reflect on what happened before. Or you've seen a piece of art and you say, I know who painted that because I've seen another piece that they did, and there are characteristics of that piece that look like that piece. Or if you want to go more mass market, you've seen the latest version of a model of a Tesla, and you go, I know why it looks like the earlier one, because I've seen things that look the same, whatever it is, right? We see things that look vaguely similar, and we begin to realize that there is a pattern shaping up, pattern taking up. And there are all these battles of the gods that will take place, which perhaps is most obvious of all in chapter 17, where Goliath comes out and issues his challenge to the people of Israel. And if you just jump over quickly to 1 Samuel 17, it's not insignificant, is it, that in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 16, Goliath comes out for 40 days to issue his challenge morning and evening, before the Israelites. We're meant to see what happens with David and Goliath in the light of what has happened in the Exodus, with that 40-year journey, where the giants are defeated at the end of it. And now David comes again to defeat a new kind of giant. Just like Joshua said, don't be afraid of what will happen, because God will go there and he will fight your battles for you. And now David comes and will be a new Joshua in the land and fight the giant and treat him with the same contempt that we will see in all those other ways. And maybe again, it's not insignificant that right down at the end of the battle, when David makes this challenge to Goliath, he says, verse 46, I will give the dead bodies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, that all the earth might know that there is a God in Israel. The very same thing that Joshua told the Israelites, that there would be a God in Israel and that they would know what happened because of the work that he did through them. So David is victorious over Goliath and moves into center view in the nation of Israel. And everybody falls in love with him, you remember. Jonathan sees him as the true heir to the throne. The people in chapter 18 will sing his songs. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. But Saul, of course, hates David. And the experiences that David will have in the household of Saul will look remarkably similar to the experiences that somebody else had back in the book of Genesis. You remember Jacob's mini exodus? All this text was on the screen back in the first session, where Jacob went into a foreign land and served for a foreign master. And Laban tricked him and kept changing his wages and, as it were, married him off to the person that he wasn't expecting. And yet the more he was hindered, the more he prospered. And eventually Laban chased him out of the land. And Jacob came across the river and gets his new name. Well, when David comes to Saul's court, he's going to be treated in the same way. Come to chapter 18 and look down in verse 17. Saul is going to give David his eldest daughter, whose name is Merab. I will give her to you for wife, he says. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. And then Saul changes his mind, doesn't he? Verse 19, at the time when Merab should have been given to David, she's given to Adriel the Mahathalite for a wife. And in the following verses, we see that David gets a different wife, a different sister. Michal follows David, and she is the one who's given to him. It's another Jacob in exile pattern, isn't it? And David's experiences mirror what happens to Jacob. Not the wrong wife is given, but the one who is not expected is given to him first of all. When you think about what happens to David a little bit later on, we're going to see time after time that he will be resented by Saul just as Jacob was resented by Laban. Come into chapter 19 and verse 8. When there is war again, David goes out and fights the Philistines and defeats them so that they flee before him. And this spirit from Saul comes up, and Saul attempts to pin him to the wall, and David escapes and flees into the night. Which hopefully now, because you've got your Exodus glasses on and you're seeing everything through the lens of the Exodus, is making you remember what happens when Israel come out of Exodus at night time. And might even make you think about what happens when Laban flees from Israel. Because Michal tricks Saul, doesn't she, in the following verses, verse 11 of chapter 19, and then a little bit further on, she lets David down through the window, and Michal takes an image, puts it in the bed and pretends that it's somebody else, so that they can't find him. It's the very same stuff which has been happening back in the book of Genesis. Saul takes a new son and gives him a different daughter, and Saul gradually falls out of favor as David falls into favor, and David has to flee just as Jacob flees. And Michal is the one who exposes Saul's idolatry. I mean, did you realize that Saul had a household god even though he was already king of Israel? Well, there it is. And humiliates his household God, just like Rachel has done and sat on them earlier on, and treated them with the kind of contempt that you and I should be treating our gods with. So these connections and these patterns start to overlap and overflow. And when we think about it, there is an Exodus pattern being worked out in Saul's world as well. Saul looks like Laban, but he also looks like, well, bizarrely, the king of Jericho. You remember in the days of Rahab? When the king of Jericho goes to hunt the spies and they send soldiers to Rahab's house, and Rahab says they're not here, and she hides them on the roof. Michael's hidden David, not on the roof, but in the bed, or at least in picture language has done so, and deceives the men of Jericho, the men of Saul, just like Rahab has deceived the men of Jericho, and lets them down out of a window to safety. Everything is starting to overlap. And Saul is not being painted, is he, in a particularly good light here. Your court does not want to look like the house of Laban. Your court does not want to look like the court of Pharaoh. It does not want to look like the time of the king of Jericho. And yet it does. And it's not just that Saul is a king who is chosen but then goes bad. It's that we need to start to see him in the light of all of these earlier characters in the Exodus who have been brought before us. So as Saul begins to pursue David, he becomes a type of something else, doesn't he? He becomes a picture of Pharaoh who starts to pursue Israel through the wilderness. Because David is now going to go out in the wilderness and flee from Saul. And maybe it's significant, and maybe it's not, that when you come over to chapter 21, David's going to eat the showbread from the temple. In other words, he's going to be given bread by God. Just like Israel, when they travel through the wilderness, will be fed manna from heaven. All the parallels start to build up. On their own, they might mean nothing. But when you start to see them in this all-inclusive kind of way, we're starting to see the significance, I think, of all of these links. It's like going to the theatre. I think I might have said this yesterday. And somebody just peeks out from behind a curtain who you've seen earlier on, and you go, I meant to connect that person to what's happening on the stage in front of me. But there's a bit more, isn't there? Come down to verse 32. We read that David's got a mole in Absalom's court. He's got a man planted there to feed him information. It's Hushai, the Archite, who comes. And David tells him to stay in Absalom's court and feed him information backwards and forwards. And we find out that he's going to place two spies within the house. Verse 36, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, who's going to feed information to David to find out what's happening. And again, your Exodus antennae should be going up, because we've got a river crossing, we've got a wilderness mention, we've got the people passing over, and we've got two spies who are going to bring information back to God's anointed. And as we go on into chapter 16, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, which is a phrase I can't say very well, meets him with donkeys bearing, well, I'm tempted to say bearing bread and wine, certainly bringing bread and water in the wilderness, in order to feed the king's household, fruit for the king's young men, and wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. Chapter 16 and verse 14, the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan River, and that's where they refresh themselves. Got all these little connections between what's going on back in the days of the Exodus and now in the days of this rebellion. And again, not insignificant, I don't think, that as this mole in Absalom's court rises in importance, Hushai will pass the word on to David. And these two spies, chapter 17 and verse 17, are going to be hidden. Well, what a coincidence. And again, God doesn't work in coincidences. Hidden by grain in order so that nobody can find them. We saw a map yesterday of the journey that Joshua went on when they came across the Jordan in the conquest, and that the Lord Jesus would go on when he made his way across the river to heal blind Bartimaeus and go up towards Jerusalem to go to the cross. Well, isn't it remarkable that that exact same pattern is seen in reverse in the days of Absalom's rebellion, when David goes out, voluntarily giving up his throne, and then will come back again to claim it when Absalom falls. And you remember all the colourful way in which Absalom falls. Absalom's a new pharaoh. He's making the conquest go backwards. And David, well, looks like he's giving up the conquest that God has given him, and then will turn things back and ultimately go back to his throne. Exile and Exodus work in all these interacting and odd ways as we make our way through the scriptures. And we're meant to see, not because this is the only way of reading it, but because yet again we've got a pattern that just shows a little bit more light about why the Exodus is such a critical and fundamental story to this. But it's not perfect, is it? It's not working in the way that we might expect it to. David conquers the land. We look at it and we go, now it's there, Lord. Now we ought to be ready. And yet things do not work out. Somebody else is needed. The Exodus takes us one step forward and two steps back. And we ought to be getting frustrated as we read our scriptures through. We ought to be getting angry that people are not living out the promises that God has made, until we realize that this is exactly the problem that we have with ourselves. And that we take one step forward in our discipleship, and I take 200 steps back. I don't know about you. So we get another king, and we just move on. I just want to bring you finally to 1 Kings chapter 6, please, because we get the man now who will build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. The man who will give us all these extraordinary echoes of things that we've been thinking about already. Solomon, the great king. The man who is a new Adam. He's going to name all the natural world in all of its wonder. The man who's going to request the knowledge of good and evil, or at least ask for wisdom from God, so that he might judge the people right. And the temple, when it's built, do you read over this verse? Or do you underline it in the brightest pen you've got? Because you should. 1 Kings 6 and verse 1. This is the beginning of the temple being built. In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, he began to build the house of the Lord. The temple is dated from the Exodus. That's massive. It's not just that we finally got to a point where the temple's being built, but that it's dated from that massive event in their history. We are meant to see that in its huge significance. The calendar is now being re-scaffolded around the Exodus itself. Just like when they came out of Egypt and the Passover was made, that was when the calendar was restarted. The entire fabric of their life is being shaped around the Exodus, and the temple is going to be built in the context of the Exodus. Come over to chapter 8 and just cast your eye down a few verses. Chapter 8, verse 9, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Verse 16, since the day I brought my people out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes to put my name there to build a house. Verse 21, I have finally provided a place for the ark, a covenant of the Lord which he made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Verse 51, you're not going to miss it, are you? These are your people, Solomon prays, and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Verse 53, you separated your people from among all the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, as you declared through Moses your servant, when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord, our God. Solomon's prayer, when he dedicates the temple, is bookended by references to the Exodus. The temple is going to now be the catalyst for proclaiming God's name in the earth, which is exactly what the Exodus was really designed to do. It wasn't just so God could prove that he was powerful. It wasn't just so the Israelites could go, wow, okay, we better not go into a plague of darkness again. It was so God could proclaim his power both to his own nation and ultimately to Gentiles too. And that's what Solomon's temple is supposed to do. And so there is this great assembly, this feast that is made in the days of Solomon. Verse 65 of chapter 8, Solomon held the feast at that time, and all Israel with him, a great assembly, from Labo Hamath to the brook of Egypt, before the Lord our God 7 days. And on the 8th day, he sent the people away. On a day that marks a new beginning, when we've had a 7-day week, and 8th day is the beginning of the next one, when all things now seem to become new, the people are sent away. They blessed the king, they went to their homes, they are glad of heart for all the goodness that God has shown to David his servant, to Israel his people, and everything is perfect. The Exodus is done. We don't need to carry on any further. I no longer need sessions 4 and 5. It's finished. Surely. Only yet again, 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Our task, your task and mine, brothers and sisters, is to make the Exodus louder in our own lives. It's to recognize that our greatest threat to freedom comes from within. To recognize that it may have taken 10 plagues to deliver Israel from Egypt, but it took 40 years to take Egypt out of Israel. And even then it didn't work perfectly. That's why baptism matters, because it's a memorial to freedom on God's terms. It's why bread and wine matters, because it's a memorial to freedom on God's terms. It's why Paul says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, because he says it in the context of the Exodus. God of Exodus sets us free. Free from sin. Free from the burdens of the law. Free to speak boldly. Free to enter the temple without fear. Free to serve each other in spirit and in truth. Exodus is finished. Only it's not. Not yet.